It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I am Jeff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure that you can catch each Wednesday morning at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. This month, I've been looking at the final 4 Godzilla movies that I've yet to cover on the show. And the first 2 weeks of this month looked at the hard turn toward having the series be more of a children's series, especially with All Monsters Attack. However, when it came to Godzilla vs. Hedorah, it was very clear that experimentation was on the table. The smog monster Hedorah was created from the scum and grossness of how we were treating the world in a highly industrialized planet. And Hedorah wasn't just a garbage monster, but the film kind of mixed media with some psychedelic scenes set to psychedelic music and trippy visuals, and even had some animated segments showing how the alien Hedorah was able to thrive off of pollution and other nasty stuff humans produced. Now, even though Godzilla vs. Hedorah was a favorite of the likes of Nicolas Cage, Adam Wingard, and Roger Ebert, critics in Japan, especially in 1971, responded very poorly to it, and audiences didn't really seem to connect with it either. So, longtime Godzilla producer Tomoyuki Tanaka decided that, he wanted to continue making Godzilla movies, but it was going to be out with the overly experimental and new, and kind of a return to the glory days of the 60s and a very formulaic process of how he wanted Godzilla movies to be made from this point forward. And the best way he felt that they could do that was to bring back a couple of favorites, but allow for one brand new monster from outer space. And that gave birth to Godzilla vs. Gigan. Okay, so first, Tanaka felt that the first step toward returning to the glory days of Godzilla was to bring back Ghidorah as a villain. Now, the original script was called Godzilla vs. the Space Monsters, Earth Destruction Directive, and along with King Ghidorah, there would have been 2 new monsters from outer space to tangle with Godzilla and his buddy, the other returning character from Godzilla's past, which is Anguirus for this movie. The new alien monsters would be basically split up to have one appear in this film and the other in next week's film. As indicated in the title, the monster called into action for this week's movie is Gigan. Now, we're going to talk about Gigan in a little bit more detail later because I think he's a very interesting creature that both looks classic, like he fits right in with the Toho monster lineup, and kind of different and bizarre as if he should appear in something else. But let's dig right in and check out this plot from outer space to defeat the Big G. And as the movie begins, we meet manga artist Gengo Kataka, and he mostly writes and draws stories about monsters, and he's trying to pitch a new book to his publisher, but is turned down. And it's kind of, I wonder if this is a little bit of a jab in general, because he's turned down because the publisher says the kids are a little bit too intelligent for monster stories these days. So that's a pretty good joke on the Godzilla series. But instead, Gengo is recruited to do concept art for a new theme park called World Children's Land, which is a park that is peace themed. It's building a giant Godzilla tower because Godzilla is the avatar of peace. We'll go with it. Whatever. The tower will also act as 2 things. One, an exhibit for monsters of the past, present, and the future. And it also will have a really cool lookout tower at the top in the head of the tower. So Gengo is talking to the guy in charge of the theme park, and is told by that guy that he is totally dedicated to peace and it's the only way to save the world. And Gengo's a little bit confused by the combination of peace and monsters, but he kind of blows it off because even though he's not so sure about taking the job, it's a really good paying job. So maybe that's something else to consider, if you know what I mean. But this guy also lets slip the bigger plan. After World Children's Land is built, he talks about a plan to destroy Monster Island because those monsters are hardly peaceful. So Gengo's getting a little bit of kind of inconsistent messaging, if you will, and it gives him the creeps. He doesn't like this talk of absolute peace that keeps coming up. And that's not easy for one person to achieve. It's not easy for one country to achieve. It's not easy for half the world to achieve. In fact, it's usually that sort of talk that comes from someone who wants to be a dictator. And when he goes to the World Children's Land office to basically talk a little bit more and potentially accept the job, he runs into a girl who drops a reel of audio tape. The others, including the guy that he was interviewed by at the park, basically chase after the girl, but Gingo gives the wrong direction that she ran in. So when he gets into the office, he is a little disturbed by a surveillance camera constantly following him around. And he eventually speaks to someone who calls himself the chairman of World Children's Land, Fumio Sudo, who not only looks extremely young to be the head of something quite this large, but he also mentions the orbit of M Space Hunter Nebula as something he's trying to figure out on the paper in front of him with a bunch of really complicated physics equations and so forth. And Ginko learns the tape that he has is rather important to these guys running this theme park. And they keep talking about bringing absolute peace, and that the girl who he ran into earlier who stole the tape was an enemy of peace. These are weird things for people to talk about constantly. But that girl, Michiko, tells her story later that night when she tracks Gengo down. And he learns that the people behind World Children's Land is not to be trusted. In fact, it is they who are the enemies of peace. And there was some sort of horrible revelation about the people running the park uncovered by her brother. And so when they're playing the tape on a tape player, it's just this strange signal. But that signal awakens Godzilla all the way over on Monster Island, and he's bothered by it. So Godzilla sends Anguirus to Japan to figure out what's up with that signal that's being heard. Now, as Anguirus comes ashore on Japan, he's met with a little bit of rudeness as the Japanese Self-Defense Force is waiting for him. They first try to back Anguirus off with floodlights. However, when he doesn't turn around right away, they fire upon him, forcing him to go back into the water and return to Monster Island. Without being able to find out anything, Godzilla decides this time he will accompany Anguirus, and they'll make their way to Kanto. So here's the big idea of what's going on in this movie. The people who are all dedicated to absolute peace and creating that theme park, well, they come from the planet M Space Hunter Nebula, which is a dying planet. It's dying because another alien race essentially colonized it and made it uninhabitable. So they want to come to Earth. But in order to make Earth their new home, these guys need Gigan and King Ghidorah to come and wipe out humanity. That's why they also need to blow up Monster Island so that those monsters won't get in the way. The tape that Michiko had was important because it was the second act in the signal that needed to be beamed out into space to call the two space monsters to Earth. The aliens from M Space Hunter Nebula naturally actually look like cockroaches, but they've assumed the identities of dead people on Earth and use those identities as a disguise. They basically have like a projector that shows them as human, even though they're actually really bugs. If you look at them, they're human, but their shadows show cockroaches, basically. Now, this makes it a little bit easy, obviously more easy for them to operate on Earth. But all this trouble started when Michiko realized that Chairman Sudo and Kubota, the secretary of the theme park that initially interviewed Genko, they were holding her brother hostage. So the aliens now want to kill our good guys who have uncovered their plot and then allow for reinforcements heading their way to essentially assume their identities. So when King Ghidorah and Gigan finally make it to Earth, they really just begin trashing the place. The JSDF are there to try to hold them back, but let's face it, when have they ever been able to do anything against any monster? Godzilla senses the trouble going down, and he and Anguirus arrive to figure out what these space jerks want. And when they arrive in Japan, Godzilla spots King Ghidorah, and he's none too pleased at all to see this a-hole again. So he tackles the golden dragon monster, and they start their battle against each other. Meanwhile, Anguirus squares up against this new guy, Gigan. Now, mind you, Gigan might be a bit new around here, but he's no slouch. He's tougher than little Anguirus. I always feel bad for Anguirus. He's always the one who gets he's Godzilla's little buddy. So like whenever he goes up against somebody, there's very little a four-legged creature can do, even though he's got the spikes on his back, but whatever. I digress. You got to realize that Gigan's all claws and buzzsaw and hooks and whatever. So that means Godzilla is forced to have to really take on both King Ghidorah and Gigan at one point. And obviously Ghidorah is no weakling either. In fact, Godzilla has a rough time defeating him one-on-one. But they are only there basically to lure Godzilla to the theme park and close enough to the tower that's made in his image. There, the aliens plan on blasting Godzilla with laser beams installed in the tower. And while Godzilla is getting his ass handed to him by these lasers, Anguirus gets nervous and tries to bum rush past Gigan to help, only to run right into his buzzsaw, getting his face all cut up. So it takes the humans to rig the elevator in the Godzilla tower with explosives to blow up the tower, stop the laser, kill the aliens, and allow for Godzilla to get back up on his feet to fight Gigan and King Ghidorah. And as Gigan attempts to get airborne multiple times, each time Godzilla blasts him with his atomic breath until he's finally down for good. To defeat King Ghidorah, Godzilla and Anguirus huddle up and come up with a plan. Godzilla will put all of King Ghidorah's heads in a headlock. Yeah, he does that. And Anguirus will launch himself backwards to use his spikes on King Ghidorah's body. And eventually the bad guys have to give up and decide to fly back out into space. But Godzilla and Anguirus decide, you know what, let's head home, and we need some much needed rest and let our cuts and stuff heal up. So, let's talk about the three things I like about Godzilla vs. Gigan. First, I like that this movie is kind of dedicated to that manga style at times. It even kind of plays out in terms of plot, but I'll talk about that here in just a moment. When Godzilla and Anguirus communicate with each other, they do so in word balloons like manga or comic books so that we can see what they're saying to each other. This additional ability to actually see the monsters communicating with one another, it's just simply fun. I mean, come on. And again, we're still in that post-personality for each monster phase where a lot of what we're seeing here is specifically being directed at children. And I mean, it certainly helps keep a certain levity to the movie, even though there is that one point in which Anguirus runs into Gigan's buzzsaw and he bleeds all over the place. But the whole thing really does play out like a comic book or manga too, in terms of plot, pacing, and so forth. So I really like that. It's a nice touch to kind of tie it all together with that. When the humans rigged the elevator in the tower with the explosives to defeat the bad guys and to stop the laser so that Godzilla can fight the actual monsters instead, it's a big giant drawing that Gango has done. So when the doors open, it forces the bad guys to shoot into the elevator thinking that they're looking at the good guys, but it's just a drawing of them from the artist. And then it blows up the dynamite inside. It's clever. It's a clever way to tie everything together. Second, I kind of like the plot of the villains in this. Well, yeah, sure. The best parts of this movie is the fact that we have four monsters all fighting for most of the second half of the movie. The alien plot is kind of an interesting one for one very specific reason. They were on this planet where it was then kind of taken over by another race of aliens. Then those invaders basically laid waste to the planet. And while they do make the claim that humanity is at least on the path the other aliens were that made their planet uninhabitable. And obviously we get a little bit more about war and pollution from both the original Godzilla and the previous film with Hedorah. The ultimate plan here is for these aliens from the M. Hunter, Space Nebula, whatever, is the worst title for any planet ever. it's basically their plan is to invade our planet and take it over and make it their new home. But they aren't interested in coexisting. They don't want to rule over us. They just want it all. They want to kill us all. So normally we see aliens trying to invade because they just go everywhere and invade things, and that's just what they do. But rarely is it the invaded that come here and invade us. So yeah, this alien group was invaded and forced to give up their planet. So they're just going to do the exact same thing their enemy did to them, to us. I like it that it's a new take on that whole invading alien thing. Thirdly, man, Gigan is just so cool. Like I said, he's all claws and hooks and I-beams and buzzsaw. He's terribly underused as a Godzilla monster. I do know that, he's in this movie. He's in next week's movie that we're going to talk about. And then he doesn't show up, show his chicken robot monster head again for another 30 years in a Godzilla film when he makes his return in Final Wars. I know that he's appeared in other like short form type stuff like Zone Fighter and things like that. But, in terms of the films, he's only been used 3 times. And I think he's definitely cool enough or interesting enough to be used more. He completely and totally misses the Heisei period whatsoever. So, while not totally different in terms of design like Hedorah, Gigan is clearly, he's clearly got a little bit of that Ultraman bloodline in him. He's kind of less a typical Godzilla monster, but would have fit right in with the Godzilla series cousin, Ultraman. So Gigan isn't fully biological. He's technically a cyborg, I believe. I've never really been able to find like exact like history of like, was he built? Is he entirely a robot? Is he, I think he's just a cyborg, but is he? And it seems as though he's a little bit more like a robot in Final Wars. He seems a little bit more biological here, but whatever. The visor on his eyes is, that's definitely labeled as cybernetic. I can't quite figure out a biological way his buzzsaw would work on his torso. So I have to assume that's been built into him. And it's said that his claws are metal. So that's obviously not biological either. Metal is not uniquely, or specifically biological. It's something that is normally, made, or at least smelted or something, whatever. Still, he's another different, far more sci-fi like creature, and I'm surprised that he isn't used nearly as much as he could be, with such an interesting look and those claws and that buzzsaw thing, and especially how he's used in Final Wars, where he's he ends up getting rebuilt with different types of claws instead of the hooks on his hands. So there's an opportunity here. I'm just saying, it's like let's bring Gigan back. That wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com. But don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, Instagram, and Blue Sky. You can also subscribe to get Film Seizure, both the Film Seizure podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieenema.com, to read new reviews every Friday morning. Next week, we come to the conclusion of the Godzilla films on Monster Mondays, at least to this point. And, hey, we get a little bit more Gigan, too. But join me next time for Godzilla versus Megalon. And until next week, stay spooky.